Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss J.D. Vance's peace plan for Ukraine, the death of the Marxist literary critic Frederic Jameson, and the life and times of the political reporter Olivia Nuzzi. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky gave an interview to The New Yorker this week describing J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, as, quote, too radical, unquote. He compared Vance's recently offered peace plan for Ukraine to Putin's own vision for the country. At the same time, Zelensky said more positive things about Trump, an apparent effort to persuade the man who may be the next president of the United States. Sohrab, you wrote on Vance's peace plan for us in an article titled J.D. Vance Against the Apocalypse. What exactly does Zelensky regard as too radical?
So J.D. Vance, now nearly 2 weeks ago, sat down with a podcaster, YouTuber, something like that, and he outlined what became known as the Vance Peace Plan. Although it's a sketch, it's not a detailed document, but the idea is this: that ultimately it is up to the two parties to agree to any plan, but an outline or a sketch might look like something like, uh, you know, Russia retains some of the territories that it's taken in the course of the war of the past 2.5 years. Ukraine is fortified as an independent state. It's fortified by the West, including the United States, against further Russian aggression. And then there's a demilitarized buffer zone between the two. The understanding is that this fortified, sovereign, and independent Ukrainian state, however, would not be part of any of the Western alliance structures, I assume most notably NATO, but also perhaps the European Union as well. I think this is, in many ways, as I argued in that piece, the headline is J.D. Vance Against the Apocalypse. You can find it at compactmag.com along with all of our other coverage. Um, it's just a statement of the obvious. First of all, no one thinks that Russia or Vladimir Putin's Russia is Hitler 2.0 bent on subjugating Europe. If really that was their Western capital's assessment, they would be in full mobilization mode, but they're not. So that suggests that this rhetoric of treating him as a conquering threat to kind of a wider European space, it suggests that that's overstated. So if that's the case, then it really comes down to a recognition that Ukraine can't win this war, all else being equal. We've talked about this, and I dare say both myself and Matthew and lots of our other contributors going back to the early days of the conflict, we argued that all else being equal, Ukraine can't win this thing because it's an industrial war pitting a much smaller nation, Ukraine of 40 million people, although that population has diminished dramatically now, against a much larger nation that has just a much greater industrial capacity, so it can win a shell war, basically, it being Russia. So if that's the case, then a negotiated settlement is the best path out. And everyone recognizes that part of that will be some territorial concessions. Yes, Putin says that, but lots of people in European capitals have quietly acknowledged that as well. And I mean, it's been widely reported. So if that's the case, the only other question is whether or not the West is willing to make it so that all else is not equal. For example, by allowing Ukraine to fire ever more sophisticated and powerful weapons deeper and deeper into Russia. But that's crazy and scary. And that's something that Christopher Caldwell, among others, pointed out in our pages. He wrote a piece headlined, the imminent U.S.-Russia war, because the missiles we're talking about are U.S. guided. So if Ukraine fires them, they will be interpreted by the Russians as direct US attack, US authored attack on Russia, thus starting basically World War III, pitting the US and the West against Russia and its allies. I mean, that's a hellish scenario. So if we don't want to go there, if we want all else to be equal, then just sending in like waves of, you know, Ukrainian pensioners into the meat grinder is not going to change anything. And the best thing to do for European security, for global security, for Ukraine itself, is to come to a negotiated settlement. And what Vance outlined seemed to be reasonable. Obviously, is ultimately up to the two parties to agree to it. But I think it's bizarre to say, as President Zelensky did, that this is basically restating what Russia wants. Uh, it is also inappropriate given the fact that we're in an election and we're a sovereign state and we have to have our own debates about these things. And it's not appropriate for foreign leaders to come say these things on our soil while we're having our own democratic process. And it's especially distasteful because Zelensky, at least for part of his travels in the United States, is being transported around U.S. military aircraft. So, in a sense, he's going around on, using he's traveling our the homeland using American military assets and bashing one of the two sides in our democratic electoral contest, and it's really inappropriate. It doesn't help him, and cut it out.
It's also worth talking a bit about the balance of forces in Ukraine at this moment. Uh, Things aren't going well for Ukraine right now. Russia has been gaining territory, leaning hard on Ukraine in the Eastern Front since August. The Financial Times had a report on this just yesterday, titled Russia Overwhelms Ukrainian Forces on the Eastern Front. Emma Ashford, the foreign policy analyst, uh, commented on the article saying it may well be time to revisit the common assumption that Russia can't take all of the Donbass. Uh, how does this kind of battlefield situation affect our calculation?
So I think it just goes back to what I said, which is that all else being equal, this is not a war whose dynamic can be shifted by Ukraine, unless we're willing to really escalate, and then we're facing catastrophic scenarios, as a number of people have warned, including lots of compact contributors like Branko Marcetic and Christopher Caldwell and others. So if you don't want to go there, and even the Biden administration doesn't, that's demonstrated by the way that it's slow walked every escalatory step. Although unfortunately, eventually, President Biden seems to give in. If you don't want to go there, you have to face the fact that Ukraine can't win this, and this this excursion they made into far western Russia, it seems to be being repelled. I was just looking at a New York Times story based on maps from the Institute for the Study of War, which uses satellite maps to look at claims of territory and then actually sort of try to verify them. And it does seem like it's being repelled slowly but surely. So it just, yeah, this is a reality that the Ukrainian political system as a whole has to come to terms with. And it won't help them to come to the United States and bash one of the two sides in our democratic electoral contest.
In other news, the Marxist literary critic Frederic Jameson has died. Geoff, you recently wrote for us about Marxism in the Academy in an article titled Was Marx Woke? Uh, Tell us a bit about Frederick Jameson's significance and the role of Marxism in today's university.
So Jameson was, without question, the premier Marxist literary scholar and theoretician of the past 50 years. There's not really any contest over that claim to fame, such as it is. Probably his most significant and well-known contribution was his book, Postmodernism, The Cultural Style of Late Capitalism, which was originally an essay of the same title and then was expanded into a book. And it really, I believe the original essay came out in 1984 and the book came out in 1990, thereabouts. So it really defined the discussion of this concept of postmodernism, and was, along with Jean-François Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, sort of the definitive statement on this subject, both defining postmodernism as a kind of cultural, a set of similar cultural developments that could be found across a broad range of fields, from the visual arts to music to architecture, to popular culture, to academic scholarship itself, uh, and that Jameson's account of it, as the title implies, attempted to root it in the evolution of the capitalist mode of production. Now, something that's sort of interesting about this is that his definition of late capitalism became synonymous with that concept, and has been endlessly reused, and it's generally been taken to be um, synonymous with something like neoliberal capitalism. And indeed, note that the date of publication of the book of postmodernism, although the original essay was written still in the middle of the last decade of the Cold War, the book came out roughly around the same time as Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man. So it was one of these books that sort of defined this moment of the kind of the end of the Cold War, the seeming triumph of capitalism, and the decline of alternative grand narratives, as Lyotard called them. And so Jameson later made a remark that was, probably his second most widely repeated contribution, which characterized this moment um, as being a moment in which it was easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So this statement has been widely attributed to other figures, including Compact contributor Slavoj Žižek, who did use it a lot, or quote it a lot. But my understanding is that Jameson was the locus classicus of the statement. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which he, which became synonymous with, and a kind of definition of this concept of late capitalism, which he defined as the sort of set of material and economic conditions that brought about postmodernism and postmodernity as cultural expressions. So, this basic set of formulas and formulations was highly influential. And it's also worth noting here that he was sort of the last great figure in a tradition of serious Marxist literary and cultural theory and scholarship that extends really back to Georg Lukács, the Hungarian literary scholar and philosopher, who I think was the first figure to produce, really highly sophisticated accounts of the relationship between material processes and culture. So in Marxist theory, you have this distinction between base and superstructure. And there's a notion of vulgar Marxism, which is essentially the idea that base determines superstructure, and therefore that the way to understand culture is as a simple reflection or sort of mirror of the conditions of the society. And so then you have a series, and so there's at least one version of kind of Marxist cultural and literary criticism, which is considered kind of crudely reductive, right? In that it attempts to simply, essentially reduce culture to an expression of material processes. But you have a series of figures starting probably with Lukács, extending through other notables of the early to mid 20th century, like Adorno, who attempts to create a more kind of dynamic and properly dialectical depiction of the relationship between superstructure and base, right? The way that the evolution of the superstructure can kind of feed back into and help transform the development of the material conditions of production and so on back and forth. And so, I think Jameson's work, which, again, the most widely read and famous would be his postmodernism essay and book, but his other perhaps definitive work would be, and it's worth noting in relation to what I said, that his early work was really a kind of attempt to explore the implications of this earlier body of what's often called Western Marxist theory, cultural theory, cultural studies, for an English-speaking audience, right? So his books like Marxism and Form, the Prison House of Language are essentially studies of these earlier works of Marxian cultural criticism that attempt to, introduce them to an English-speaking audience. Then, his perhaps other kind of definitive work is called The Political Unconscious, which I think is the source of another of his most famous phrases, which is always historicize. So, we can see an illustration of this in the point I made about postmodernism. To understand postmodernism, you have to historicize, to these various forms of postmodern expression from, hotels in Los Angeles to, Andy Warhol images, to new forms of electronic music, have to be historicized. In other words, understood in relation to the specific historical period and conditions that they emerged out of, and also, in some way fed back into, right? And so, this the Political Unconscious is, probably his other. It's sort of a definitive theoretical work that attempts to lay out his method and present both his rationale for it and its its applicability to very specific works. So, a couple things that are kind of interesting, that just to conclude my comments here. One is that we published a piece sometime in the past. Sorry, I can't remember exactly when, but sometime in the past year, there was a review of a book called Immediacy: The Cultural Style of Very Late Capitalism, I believe. So this is a book by the literary scholar Anna Kornblue, and obviously the title is a reference to Jameson's title for postmodernism. And in that piece, our contributor Kyle Bosch points out that there's something kind of strange that happened with Jameson's use of this term late capitalism, which again became synonymous with the concept, right? When people talk about late capitalism in academia, they basically are going with Jameson's reading of it as synonymous with roughly neoliberal global capitalism, financialized capitalism, the capitalism that emerges at the end of the Cold War. So what's interesting is that, as Bosch points out, the term had previously meant something quite different and even opposed to that, which is the understanding of managed capitalism or managerial capitalism that had emerged kind of in the early 20th to mid 20th century. And interestingly, Jameson lifts the term from Ernest Mandel, who, in his, as I noted in this piece on a new translation of Marx, in his introduction to the 1976 translation of Marx's Capital, essentially used this term to mean late capitalism, is the moment in which capitalism has, arrived at this terminal stage. And the way we know it's a terminal stage is because it is no longer able to kind of spontaneously sustain itself, but must rely on more and more kind of state management and intervention. And so, in other words, late capitalism in this original sense actually did seem to name a kind of terminal point where laissez-faire entrepreneurial capitalism had given way to this much more managed and circumscribed mode of market relations, right? Which essentially, we can equate with the mid 20th century kind of consensus around, roughly a sort of a highly constrained and managed form of capitalism. And so, the earlier Marxist idea was this proved that capitalism could no longer sustain itself as a, spontaneous expression of sort of bourgeois dynamism, but instead, produced too many crises and therefore needed to be managed. And it was late because it was transitioning towards something else, right? Towards a society in which market forces were even more constrained, i.e., some form of socialism. So Jameson basically turns this on its head, and defines late capitalism to simply mean this moment at which capitalism seems to have no recognizable terminal point, right? It's gone back to this mode of constant dynamic expansion of global expansion, and that it's defined again by the impossibility of imagining any other order. So it's a striking kind of act, and I think we can both understand why he did this, and also as Bosch does, perhaps criticize it, because it's a striking kind of redefinition of the term that I think raises a lot of questions. And my own instinct is I think Jameson really is a giant, as far as his incredible sophistication and kind of intellectual rigor and complexity, and ability to combine a kind of sensitivity to individual works of literature, art, etc., with a kind of grand theoretical ambition. I think these are all things that it's very hard to find anyone else who exemplifies those qualities, in academia in recent decades. But I do also think that this notion, and I won't get into this because it would take us too far from the topic at hand, but I think there is a kind of sense in which this notion that he developed of late capitalism as a capitalism that can no longer imagine its own end, a sort of terminal capitalism, is it has in some ways for reasons I won't go into now, has in some ways become dated, or perhaps is at least to me, for reasons I could explain, but we'll leave that for another time. I think it has kind of passed as a useful description of the contemporary, and so what will succeed it, and I think I would recommend people read Kyle Bosch's essay, "Too Late for Late Capitalism," because I think it makes some version of this case, and what exactly will succeed it as a framework, if anything, is another question. But I would still recommend people, if they're interested in this sort of thing, turn back to these books because they are quite remarkable achievements.
I won't add much other than just a bit of admiration for the opening case study that Jameson put forward in postmodernism, trying to contrast various kind of modern art or architectural projects with what he defined as the postmodern. And of course, there's the famous, and it's an illustrated edition, so yeah, it's a very rich book. I felt very proud to have finished it at like age 21. I don't know how much I absorbed, and I'm keen now, in light of his passing, to go back to read that one, and to reread that one, and then pick up valences of the dialectic and others. But in the opening, he does this kind of contrast between a pair of shoes painted by Van Gogh, and then later on Andy Warhol doing this kind of mechanical reproduction of a bunch of shoes that is flat, that lacks kind of a sense of historical depth, etc. That he associates that lack of sort of historical depth as one of the sort of features of the postmodern condition. And of course, you're exactly right. I think Geoff to like pinpoint the how he intervenes, how he and the tradition Jameson represented intervene on the base superstructure relationship that it's much more complex than the kind of earliest forms of Marxist literary and cultural criticism allowed. I'm thinking of, like, in his own way, like Trotsky was also a cultural critic and wrote on these issues, but from a fairly, I would say, rudimentary. Although even Trotsky was more complex than and lots of 19th century Marxist cultural criticism, and then you get this tradition beginning with Lukács and the Frankfurt School, and I think Jameson was a real flowering of that. But without saying more, I should preview that Geoff and I will be recording a mutual episode of the Blame Theory podcast, which is our podcast, or his podcast, because Geoff's the host and the anchor. But the idea is to try to inculpate or exculpate great ideas for the shape of our world. And so if we're going to do Blame Marx and Marxism, specifically pegged to two things. One is, of course, the new translation of Marxist Capital that just came out from Princeton University Press. Geoff wrote about that for our pages. He went to the opening salon or the launch salon, and it was he does a fascinating job. Hard to summarize piece, but that's found under the headline "Was Marx Woke?" And as it happens, I'm kind of working my way through Capital, but the older, the previous translation, the Ben Fox translation. With our friend Ben Burgess. He is running a Capital class, and he does it through the lens of analytic Marxism, which is a whole other tradition. But at any rate, so all that makes it worthwhile for us to blame or exculpate or do both to Marx, especially in light of the fact that the communist accusation is taking on renewed currency on the right. So look out for that. It's not, we haven't even recorded it yet, but I certainly look forward to that conversation.
So Twitter was set of Twitter by revelations that Olivia Nuzzi, a political reporter for New York Magazine, had engaged in some kind of relationship with RFK Jr. RFK Jr., of course, the independent presidential candidate who has since endorsed Trump, is married to Cheryl Hines, the star of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And Nuzzi was engaged to the political reporter Ryan Lizza. It's been a little interesting to chart the kind of changing reactions to this story as information has leaked out. I at first saw people expressing admiration for the erotic power of the Kennedy name and the Kennedy clan, given that Nuzzi is about 30 and RFK is 40 years older, 70 plus. And then we got a slightly different story. Well, it was actually, it wasn't a physical affair, it was emotional and digital. So suddenly we seem to be out of the kind of somewhat unsettling world of JFK Camelot era machismo, White House machismo, and into this more 2020s world of online interactions. And then Jessica Reed Krause, the author of the Substack House and Habit, who is one of the in-house chroniclers in a way, or one of the most sympathetic chroniclers of the Kennedy campaign, published a piece called "The Talented Miss Nuzzi." Obviously, the comparison is to the talented Mr. Ripley, a kind of class interloper who is willing to wield seduction in a cold-blooded way to advance himself. And in that piece, Krause really paints Kennedy as the victim of a campaign of pornographic harassment, as he's bombarded with erotic images and flirtatious messages, and he blocks her, and then he unblocks her because she calls him and says, "I have a very important message to bring," and then he blocks her again after she communicates inappropriately. but he's somehow weak. He's somehow the victim, and he has hired a private security agent who once worked for Jeff Bezos on his own kind of related problems to investigate the possibility of a civil suit and potential criminal referrals against Miss Nuzzi. So we've gone from the Kennedy Riz to really Kennedy as victim of diabolical sexual harassment from this voracious and cold-blooded woman, supposedly. Uh, what do we make of this story? What does it say about the uh, transformation of American manhood? The incredible shrinking Kennedys? What's going on?
It just puts me in mind of one of the best jokes in Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, his novel about my and Geoff's and Matthew's ignoble profession, in which journalists show up to the country of Ismailia to cover like a coup d'état and like an invasion. It's loosely modeled on Benito Mussolini's conquest of Abyssinia, and when the journalists first show up, they're all sort of Western journalists. The Ishmaelite authorities say, sorry, we ran out of our usual press cards, but we have these. We have the cards we use to identify the local prostitutes. Cross out that and write your name.
Well, I was just going to remark a sort of side narrative of this, which caught my attention, was, Nuzzi is, I would say, a very good political reporter. I read her features in New York Magazine and always find them enjoyable and illuminating. And one that struck me was that she was somebody who early on wrote on Biden's clear decline, right, and wrote a long piece about this, which was, of course, at the time, before we passed through into Kamala mania, was extremely controversial among sort of Democratic partisans and loyalists. And something that struck me was that as soon as this RFK story dropped, there was a huge chorus of people bringing that up again, right? That Nuzzi had, written this piece basically talking about not just Biden's decline, but the kind of code of silence about it and the unwillingness of many political reporters to be honest about what they were observing, and the sort of strange evasions of the Biden White House. And it was striking to see that, even after the June debate debacle and the elevation of Kamala and sort of disappearing of Biden, there are still people who are very mad at Nuzzi for having written this piece, even though, as I understand it, everybody after the debate kind of came around and admitted she had been right, at least more or less. So, one thing that kind of struck me was a lot of the controversy around her prior to this was regarding her writing this piece about Biden's decline, and again, the kind of code of silence about it. And I wonder to what extent this scandal would have gotten the same traction if she hadn't sort of had a target on her back from all of these kind of, blue anon adjacent people who, were ferociously defending the party line at the time, that, if you thought Biden was declining, you had been duped by Russian disinformation or whatever you're supposed to believe. And so it was very odd to see that even after everybody has kind of passed through the looking glass and embraced Kamala mania and thanked Joe for his service, they're still very mad at Olivia for having written this piece, which I was very struck by, just because of the cognitive dissonance it displayed. That sort of everybody thinks, as far as I can tell, that it's fine that Biden, was sidelined / stepped down, that Kamala was elevated ahead of him. clearly against Biden's own will. Like all the people who are fine with that sequence of events and are happy about the current Democratic ticket are also still really mad that Olivia Nuzzi, spoke before it was permissible to say these things, and yet they're not mad about Biden having been sidelined because presumably they agree that he was actually declining. So it just it revealed something very strange about the ongoing kind of taboos and kind of weird groupthink and the cognitive dissonance that produces among a certain subset of Democratic partisans. Some of them just kind of influencers or whatever, but and whatever, just random social media accounts, but some of them also, people within the media who basically were sustaining the code of silence that Newsy effectively critiqued and exposed in that piece.
And I do not think there will be any ethics investigations or anyone suspended from their work for failing to report on Biden's clear decline. So with that, thanks to you listeners. Thanks, Geoff and Sohrab. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.